Hey, how's it going, everyone? So today we're going to be reacting to Overlord Cut Content Season 1, Episode 3, Ainz's First Battle and the Reason for His Extreme Caution by Ainz. Go ahead and get into it.
Last cut content we talked a whole lot about Nazarick and its Floor Guardians. This skipped details behind the hierarchy of power, along with the general information attributed to its logistics. Where that brings us to in Episode 3 is the very first conflict that we see Ainz take part in. A completely one-sided battle that introduces us to his cautious nature. Like, we're not just shown his brief thoughts on certain incidents, but instead given a proper explanation for each and every one of the actions he takes. So, if you've ever wanted an in-depth look into Ainz's thought process, then that's exactly what you're gonna get here. That and all the extra action that was left out from when he saved Carne village.
That's actually something
First,
I do care
this
to
video is sponsored by Ragnarok Origin, the recently released mobile version of the popular MMORPG Ragnarok Online. As a sequel that continues to capture the very essence of the original, you can also expect graphics that are significantly improved, enhanced combat mechanics that refine the feel of the original, then a whole lot of new content and cosmetics to experience with a friendly community. Plus, aside from a big upcoming event for the celebration of the game's half-year anniversary, right now you can explore the game's newest update. A brand new area in the form of Aldebaran, and the new Alchemist job class which can be upgraded from the
might
Merchant
not be a
World.
mobile game.
So, with this new area providing all sorts of undiscovered dungeons filled with hidden rewards, you can explore it as an alchemist that uses potions to interrupt enemies and buff party members. It's one of the many ways you can approach this game's versatile playstyle. Then, up until June 12th, you can also partake in the limited time Psy crossover, a special offline event in which you can receive giveaways from Psy himself. So, if you want to check that or any part of the new update out, then be sure to use the link in the description to download Ragnarok Origin for free today.
If you do want to check the game out, go ahead and check it out. Odds are I won't, because it's a mobile game, and I don't know this for sure. I've never played this game before, but it's most likely heavily monetized.
But now, let's get back to the
It's
video.
just the facts of how most mobile
Episode
games
3,
are.
The Battle of Carne Village, covering chapters 3 and 4 from Volume 1 of the light novel. What we see Momonga using here right at the beginning is a useful item known as the Mirror of Remote Viewing, a tool that many player killers or player killers would use to scout for targets back in Yggdrasil. Unlike in the New World though, the anti-intelligence magic that many players would use to conceal themselves often made this item far less useful than it was right now, especially since it was also vulnerable to counterattacks from reactive barriers. But for Momonga to be able to scout the outside area without any threat to himself right now, well, that was reason enough for him to try and make use of it here. He needed to confirm whether he was still in their homeworld of Helheim or not. As we know though, what he saw instead of the despair-filled landscape that he was used to was nothing more than grassy plains which seemed to spread for miles. Momonga would spend hours—
I actually did not know what it looked like, because I thought he lived in like a swamp or a marsh or something. I thought that's where Nazarick was. But to find out it was like in Helheim and like this greenish battle looking, I'm trying to picture it from God of War. That's pretty much the only game I've ever seen Helheim in. But yeah, it's a land of the dead. You can guess what it would look like.
Figuring out—
I didn't know it was in Helheim itself. That's pretty cool.
The mechanics of this mirror, all while failing to find any sentient life whatsoever. Plus, to make things even more awkward, Momonga couldn't help but feel uncomfortable by the constant presence of Sebas. Not just because he was his designated escort, but also because it constantly reminded him of Touch Me. Specifically the fact that both were extremely scary when they became angry. Now, an interesting thing to note about NPCs like Sebas is that ever since the attainment of sentience, each would use video game expressions as if they were normal. Terms like
Sebas actually had one of my favorite dialogues whenever they were all swearing loyalty. And Sebas, like they were doing this whole thing of why they like Momonga or whatever. And Sebas mentions that out of all of the 43, you're the one who stayed. That was like, oh man. Albedo, she steals Sebas's words from him, but he said it before her.
Skills, class, and level were used in the very same context they would be in Yggdrasil.
He's a Dragonian,
like when Momonga
I
had
think.
offered Sebas the opportunity for a break, Sibas instead responded that he possessed an item which made physical fatigue impossible. So, because he and all the others were familiar with these terms, it made it a lot easier for Momonga to order them around using them. In any case, it was after having mastered the control of the mirror that Momonga decided he would teach Demiurge how to use it as well. That way he could then apply them as the foundation for Nazarik's security system, the early warning network that I had mentioned in the previous episode. Now, it was after Momonga had spotted the village that his first thoughts were of how it held no value to him. Sure, he would have saved them if they had some important information to share, but it was rather clear that these were all nothing more than common folk. It was as soon as he'd come to that conclusion, though, that Momonga immediately realized he was different now. Emotions he knew he would have felt like pity, anger, or unease were now just completely gone. To him, what he was watching looked no different than wild animals displaying survival of the fittest.
So that's the moment he noticed his humanity was stolen.
It was a thought that seemed to indicate he was already considering humans as a different species. So, out of the fear that this could in fact be true, Momonga quickly began to justify it with excuses. He felt he couldn't just charge in and save everyone, since there could very well be a valid reason for their mass execution. Then, even if there wasn't, his very interference could make enemies with the country these soldiers served. So, it was very obvious the safe option was to just stay back and do nothing. What eventually began to sway his decision was the very peculiar actions of Enri's father. You see, although it wasn't fully explained in the anime, I'm sure you could tell that it seemed as if this man had made eye contact here.
It
That
does look like he made eye
possible
contact.
without the anti-intelligence magic I had mentioned earlier, but even so, Enri's father still looked directly at him. He had made eye contact, then asked for his daughters to be saved, almost like he was asking Momonga personally. This still wasn't enough to force Momonga into action, but it did make him remember Touchme's tendencies to help people. A debt he felt he owed, since Touchme's intervention actually saved him from quitting Yggdrasil altogether. Had Touchme not prevented the constant PK of Momonga's character, then Ainz, Gon, and Nazarik wouldn't exist today. That's just how important Touchme was to everything. Now, a quick thing to mention about the gate spell used to get to Carne is that this was Yggdrasil's most reliable teleportation spell. Not only was its range practically infinite, but its failure rate was a confirmed 0%. It was by far the easiest and most stable method of traversal, ensuring Momonga could arrive right on time to save Enri. To add a bit more action to this scene though, it was prior to Momonga's arrival that Enri would do everything she could to save Nemu, including attempt to attack the knight that was pursuing her. Mere moments before the knight was about to cut her down, she had actually moved faster than his sword and punched him right in the helmet. It was an attack fueled by all the anger and rage she'd kept bottled up inside her. A strike she'd put her entire body and soul into. Despite the impact having broken her hand though, Enri did manage to buy Nemu a few more seconds. This single punch had actually sent the knight staggering backwards, giving Momonga enough time to finally show up. Even if he didn't though, Enri was ready to lay down her life for Nemu here, much to the point that she was even willing to use her flesh to do so. If her own body was the only tool left to prevent the sword from reaching her sister, then Enri was ready to make sure the sword would stay stuck there. She was prepared to push the sword so deep into her flesh that the knight would have no chance of getting it back in.
It's it's a hellacious thing right there. So if you're gonna shield somebody with your body, make sure they can get away, because what's gonna happen is you're gonna get stabbed. Your body is gonna go limp and it's gonna fall on that girl, and she is gonna have no way to lift you off. The knights are then going to lift your corpse off, and then they are going to slaughter the girl. No. If you're trying to save somebody, you tell them to fucking go. Just run. Don't stop. That's how you do it. You take the bullet, the blade, whatever. You tell them to keep going. Sure, there was another knight there. He could have chased after her, but it's still a better chance than what she had if her body had went limp and fell on her.
Until she was dead. Fortunately, it didn't have to come to that, since the very presence of Momonga halted the knights right where they were standing. It was a brief moment of fear followed by the 9th tier spell Grasp Heart, a wise choice that covered multiple outcomes just in case the worst happened. What I mean is that Momonga didn't just choose Grasp Heart for its instant death, but also because in the off chance the knights could resist it, then its secondary stun effect would allow Momonga to grab the girls and jump through the gate again. This was him implementing his motto of always having a plan B and evacuation strategy. Even when he had switched his focus to the second night, Momonga still planned to follow up with a second attack. He truly believed a spell as weak as Dragon Lightning wouldn't be able to one-shot him. But when that's exactly what happened, the knight's apparent weakness went to shock even him. You see, ever since he'd become level 100, Momonga had become accustomed to using only spells in the 8th tier or above. So for this knight to drop at a mere 5th tier spell, well, that just meant that he'd been worrying for nothing. Of course, he did still consider the possibility that he hit for a crit or just faced 2 incredibly weak enemies, but that was something it was no longer possible to even be nervous about. Instead, he could only approach every situation with increased levels of caution. That said, Momonga decided to continue his tests with Create Undead next, this time bringing forth a low-level monster that was practically useless to him. With a level that was only at 35, this Undead Knight was only good for taking aggro.
The Death Knights are only level 35? Dude.
It was Momonga's favorite tank due to its 2 special abilities. The first was its ability to take all aggro, and the other was the ability to withstand any attack once. No matter how strong or powerful an attack was, this Undead Knight would always be able to survive it with 1 health remaining, making it a useful shield for tanking just about anything. Now, a major thing Momonga had noticed about how these monsters acted was that they no longer needed to stand near its summoner anymore. Normally, the creature would just hover around where it was summoned, but this one instead took its order then ran away to fulfill it. It was a significantly increased level.
Having summons like that in a video game would be pretty crazy.
Of freedom in comparison to Yggdrasil, another unknown of this new world that Momonga felt could.
I mean, I can kind of order Selene or the Ifrit and all the EGIs, Eggies, whatever. I can kind of order them around to certain areas, but it's still around the caster. You know, it has to be within a certain distance. And even then, you can just kind of order them to do skills, but it's not really like that, you know.
Prove fatal. It was.
I mean, you can even put them on auto, but even then, it's still not that great.
After this and Albedo's appearance, that Ainz would then proceed to try and help.
I really wanted to be a summoner.
His initial attempt to get close had only made the 2 of them.
I love being a necromancer,
so,
but
while trying to consider his options, Momonga decided to search his items.
It's really hard because, like it said, you don't have many options. So, like, the AI, it's not that great whenever you're trying to be a summoner or a necromancer or anything in video games like that. It's just due to the AI. If you were able to actually, you know, give orders to the minions and tell them to go places and stuff, that would be different.
Item box. A bag known as an infinity haversack, which could store any combination of items up to a max weight of 1,000 pounds. As for the item he chose, well, this was nothing more than a minor red potion which healed for 50 HP back in Yggdrasil. A potion that used Justice energy to heal, which meant that it was actually poisonous to Momonga. The only reason he'd kept it in his inventory at all was because not all his guildmates were undead like him. So even though this potion may do damage to him, he knew it could possibly come in handy to heal others. Now, to quickly explain what these 2 barriers did, the first prevented any living things from passing through it, while the second weakened all types of projectile attacks, both of which would have been perfected with a final application of an anti-magic spell. Because he didn't know the types of magic that existed in this world though, Momonga instead chose not to. His final gift was instead an artifact, items with fixed sets of data that couldn't be augmented. If you remember how I mentioned before, almost everything in Yggdrasil could be customized with data crystals, thus the reason why it was such a popular game in the first place. Any item that couldn't be customized was instead referred to as an artifact.
It was a popular game, but at the same time, it wasn't because it only lasted 12 years.
One of which was the Goblin General's horn we see here. So, should Enri choose to use this horn, then 12 permanent goblin summons would appear before her, all of which would only disappear after having been killed. And that's the last key thing worth noting before Momonga would identify himself as Ainz. If we switch over to the scene with the Death Knight now, the commander we see cowering in fear here was actually explained to be the person who killed Enri's father. According to the knights who were with him, it was after having chased the girls across the village that Enri's father would confront him and hold him back. Being a knight that wasn't skilled on his own though, the commander had no choice but to call for help, resulting in the other knights coming to split the 2 of them apart. Then, as soon as the commander was free, he had taken his rage out on the father by stabbing him over and over again.
Huh.
So, for him to die the way that he did, well, that was just an extremely fitting end to a very scummy character.
I agree.
Now, the Squire zombie who had grabbed his leg right before was actually a result of the Death Knight's passive. You see, whenever the Death Knight kills a target, an undead with the same level would spawn in its place, making this a useful ability that did well to expand the size of Ainz's local army.
Shit.
That said, the fact this level 35 Death Knight was still running around causing havoc only went to further prove just how weak everyone was. Like, when compared to his other summons like the Grim Reaper Thanatos or the Overlord Wiseman, the Death Knight would be nothing more than a typical mob. The reason why he's hesitant to use those, though, is that summons of that nature require experience instead of magic. Experience Ainz wasn't sure he'd get back if he happened to use it. Fast forward a bit to Ainz's introduction, and the first thing we get to is an explanation of the mask we see him wearing. This was an event item called the Mask of Jealousy. A cursed item not because of what it can do, but instead because of what it represents. What I mean is that the only way a player could obtain this item was by being in-game for 2+ hours on Christmas Eve between 7 PM and 10 PM. As soon as those conditions were met, the item was then forcibly added to the player's inventory,
All you had
making
to do
it a
was log
permanent
in.
cosmetic
Still...
gifted to all the loners, thus the reason many considered it to be a curse.
I mean, you could log in and be online and still get the item and still, not be at your computer. There's, oh wait, I don't know, because you have to use the neural link. That would make that hard. So I was going to say, in Final Fantasy, there's this one dancing guy on my server who's probably been there dancing for 3 years in the same spot. When he, wants to play the game, he'll disappear for a little bit and then he'll show right back up to that spot and be dancing. And anytime you visit the server and go into that very populated area, that guy will be there. Usually. If not, he'll be there next time you go. But yeah, there is that. I was going to say you could stay logged in, but with that, the neural link, it's maybe not possible.
As for the gauntlets Ainz wore to cover his hands, these were nothing more than crafted items which boosted the wearer's strength. Typical iron gauntlets that you could find on anyone. Now, it was during the time that Ainz was at the village leader's house that he was very careful with how he was going to gather information. Reason being that revealing too much about his lack of knowledge could definitely be a weakness that was used against him. Sure, it may not have an impact with a village like this, but when interacting with people who carried more authority, there was no telling how they would eventually plan to use that vital information against him. Plus, because Henry showed fear of his undead nature, it was only natural to assume that humans would come to condemn him. That's why he felt the need to keep almost everything about himself completely hidden. That said, Ainz did know that he could always use magic to get the information he wanted, but after using memory manipulation on the two sisters, he felt it was best to save some of his magic points. You see, even overwriting just a couple minutes from both of the girls' memories had used significantly more magic points than he was willing to part with, much to the point that he could feel its depletion all the way to his core. So, with only his experience as a businessman to guide him through this conversation, Ainz was able to elegantly shift the conversation from one of compensation all the way to one of information. Well, more like he was lucky enough to spot the opening he could use to shift it that way. It was after having determined his gold coins were worth double the amount of the standard that the village leader knew he wouldn't be able to properly pay him. So, as the leader began to bargain for a lower price, Ainz offered to take information instead. You see, because Ainz had portrayed himself as this caster who had been...
I didn't even realize that their coins were worth 2 of his, one of his coins is worth 2 of theirs. That does throw a different perspective onto that. I didn't realize that.
Holed up in a place called Nazarick, there was no skepticism to be had towards his sudden inquiry for knowledge. He had made them believe they were making a completely fair trade with him, resulting in the perfect transition into what Ainz really wanted. So, as soon as it was confirmed that he'd been transported to a different world, Ainz began to operate under the assumption that he couldn't have been the only player to be transported here. If there were a larger group of Japanese people who'd been teleported alongside him, then Ainz wanted nothing more than to join up with them. He knew it was likely the best course of action.
I'm actually curious on what's happening to his body in the real world. Is it like rotting in his chair? Is it just been like a couple seconds that have passed in the real world? You never know.
The only problem with that, though, was that many players viewed his guild as the enemy. You see, the Guild of Ainz often roleplayed as this evil organization, one that would always do plenty of player killing. That being the case, he wasn't sure the hatred towards his guild would have died down by now. So, in order to avoid any potential conflict with other players, Ainz felt it was...
It would be pretty crazy if he finally got sent back to the real world. Time had actually passed. His body had decayed in the chair. He was a skeleton, but his consciousness still got put back into the skeletal form. That way, even in the real world, he's still like a lich. Or I guess he's not a lich, he's an overlord. But I want to say he's like a demi-lich, the highest form of lich, because I've never heard of overlord. And it might exist in something, I don't know.
was best to make as few enemies as possible, a task he knew would require procedure. If he was going to venture out into the outside world, then Ainz knew from now on any action would require justification. He couldn't just go and slaughter everyone he came across because other players who still had their humanity would most...
Then again, he's not a demi-lich. He can't be a demi-lich because he still has a skeletal form. A demi-lich, they usually... It's like maybe a skull left or a hand or just maybe even nothing. Demi-liches, they go to the point where there's like nothing left. When you're a demi-lich, you're like crazy powerful.
Most definitely look down on it. Should there come a time where he did have to face off against other players, though, then...
I actually think one of the only other liches that would be as strong as a demi-lich would be a Baelnorn lich, or a Baelnorn lich is a elf who usually ties his soul to a forest or a tree, or an arc lich. An arc lich is a good lich, somebody who dedicated their life to healing, or they had a lawful good, neutral good, or some type of good morality in life, even though they were a necromancer. And rather than binding their spirit to I think it's a phylactery, like a lich does, they do it too, but it's one that doesn't involve harming other people or taking a soul or something like that. So they're blessed with good powers. They're good liches, even though they're necromancers.
The best Nazarick could do was hold off 30 level 100s. Combine this with the effects of a world item he currently had stored away, then Nazarick would become this impregnable fortress. The main reason he couldn't rely solely on that, though, was because every time this world item would be cast, the cost of using it was Ainz's level, meaning that if a raid was launched with multiple waves of backup, Nazarick and Ainz would eventually be worn down to the point where the world item was useless. Of course, all this focus on warfare was a very narrow point of view, but Ainz wasn't so naive as to not consider the worst possible outcome. Everything he was thinking about now was him just accounting for the worst. It would definitely be ideal to just get along and work things out through discussion, but Ainz certainly wasn't going to let himself become complacent. That being the case, the most important thing right now was to increase his war potential. That and gather as much information on the new world as possible. Once those two things were complete, it would then be possible to approach every scenario with the utmost caution, giving Ainz the edge he definitely felt he lacked right now. But yeah, that's pretty much it for this episode's cut content. I know it's right in the middle of Shield Hero, but Season 2 hasn't really been doing well. Plus, it's also been extremely confusing to follow. I'll definitely go back and finish the power profile on Naofumi, but if this video does do well, then I'll keep doing Overlord cut content until Season 4 comes out. Now, before I go, I'd like to thank Ragnarok Origin once again for sponsoring this video. As a game that only adds to the original from almost 20 years ago, you should definitely use the link to check out how they revitalized it, especially if you're someone who's played it before. But anyway, as always, thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this type of anime content, then you already know what to do. So, until next time.
I really enjoyed this one. I like seeing the stuff that's, been cut. A lot of this was really good. If you did enjoy the video, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.